Hello and welcome once again to one of my videos. I'm Charles Bernard and I am a professional paperback book cover illustrator who founded the Online Art Academy. In this video I'm going to be talking about a subject that is seldom talked about. I'm pretty sure that you probably haven't heard about this unless you have gone to an expensive, famous art school that may or may not have taught you what I'm going to show you in this video. And this is something that the great illustrators of the past, such as Harold von Schmidt, Bob Peak, Al Parker, Bernie Fuchs, knew about and used in their great illustrations. And that is one of the reasons why their illustrations are so great. When I was working at famous artist schools in Westport, Connecticut as an artist, one of their guiding faculty members was the great Western painter Harold von Schmidt. And there were other famous artists that were part of the guiding faculty for the school, and each of them, except for the great Albert Dorn, wrote a book, a kind of textbook for the school, that talked about how they made an illustration, what went into the illustration. And this idea that I'm going to be introducing you to in this video came from the book by Harold von Schmidt, and he talked about this, which is called the structural concept. This structural concept is part of composition. Paintings that lack this structural concept, they don't communicate the message that the artist wants to communicate as clearly and powerfully as those paintings that have this structural concept, on which the composition is based. Your paintings must connect with the viewer, or the viewer will just walk away, won't be engaging with that painting, because it's not speaking to them. But through this structural concept, you can get the viewer to engage with your painting and get the message across to the viewer about what this painting is all about, what it is trying to tell you. So now it's time to show you what I'm talking about when I talk about the structural concept. It's best to begin with some kind of idea in mind as to what you want to say in your painting or illustration. Now, let me talk about one painting that was done by the great Peter Helk, another guiding faculty member for the famous artist schools. Peter Helk did a painting of an old-time racing car, and what he wanted to say about this car was the speed at which it traveled. And he needed to come up with some kind of structural concept to get this mood or feeling across. I'm going to do a quick, rough sketch of what his painting looks like. So here is the racing car, and the wheels here, wheels in back, and these two guys are sitting in this car. The whole car is leaning a bit toward the left. It's not perfectly perpendicular like that, and making the wheels and the car, everything lean a little bit like this toward the left. That helps to get that feeling of speed across. Now, what he also did was he added a cast shadow down here, and then back here there's the dust that's being kicked up by the car, and over here he has a building on a hill. There's some bushes here, and then in back of the building there are these trees coming down like this. There's a rock here and a post right there and a road back here. Here I carried the sketch a little bit further so you get a better idea of what his painting looks like. The structural concept that he uses are these implied lines, and I'll be talking more about implied lines later in the video. These implied lines are moving back like this. and also the trees back there. The car itself has somewhat of a triangular shape, excluding the two figures there. Just the car itself feels like it has this tapering to it, you see, like that. So it's taller here, but more narrow here. So that also sets up these implied lines that are moving toward the right. They're moving back into the distance. These lines are kind of speed lines. When you see a cartoon character, for example, and the cartoon character is running like this, sometimes you see the artist adding these speed lines like that. Well, the same idea can be seen here in Peter Helck's painting. These lines rushing back like that into the distance represent speed lines, thereby giving a greater feeling of speed or movement to the car. The fact that all those speed lines are rushing into the distance makes the car feel like it is moving forward. And in addition to that, what I said earlier, the car itself has been placed at an angle like that, distorting it somewhat. And that distortion further helps to create the illusion of a speeding car. So the structural concept that Peter Helck came up with for his painting to get this feeling of speed across is speed lines. He bases his entire composition on these speed lines. Structural concept can be just about anything, whatever will help to communicate what you want to say. The structural concept is what is called the underlying structure. And if you've watched my other videos on composition, you will have learned about this underlying structure because I talked about it quite a bit in those videos on composition. Now, the structural concept could be anything. Anything that makes an underlying structure. The best kind of underlying structures are those concepts that communicate what you want to say most effectively. Let me give you a quick example here of an underlying structure that has a structural concept that helps to express what I want to say. So if I want to say something like stability, this subject is very stable. So how would I get that feeling across of these figures here? They express stability. Now, the way it's expressed is through a shape that is very stable. And that shape is the geometric shape of the triangle. The triangle doesn't tip over unless you put it on its head, where the point is, like that. Now there's a feeling that it's tipping over. But when you position the subject, like I did here, where it doesn't tip over, and it looks like this, where the base is resting on the ground like that, and the tip or point is at the top, a feeling of stability is communicated. So that's an example of a structural concept that expresses the feeling of stability, that these figures here are very stable. They're not in action, they're not tipping over or anything like that. They're just sitting there. Another example, what if I wanted to express this idea of violence and war? Well, one structural concept that could be used is an explosion, like this. The feeling of something exploding, moving outward like that from the point of explosion. So this becomes the structural concept on which I can then build, let's say, some soldiers that are fighting here, and some other elements over here that form this sort of explosion shape like that. That helps to get this idea across of violence, war. I went ahead and carried this rough sketch that I started somewhat further, as you can see here, and this structural concept that I pointed out to you of this explosion-like shape is underlying this scene here of battle. So that becomes the underlying structure. And you can see that structure here, for example. Now this doesn't have to be an exact shape like that that looks like an explosion. It just has to give the feeling of an explosion taking place. So it's something like that, where these lines are all radiating outward, just like with this explosion shape that I started this sketch with. Think of a painting in two ways. One in which the feeling or illusion of a three-dimensional world exists. A world in which there are forms that have volume, that appear solid-looking, three-dimensional. A picture that has perspective to it, where you get that feeling of depth, like what I'm indicating now with these hills or mountains moving back in space like this, getting lighter in value as they move further back. So this is an example of trying to get this feeling of a third dimension or a feeling of perspective into the painting. And then I could have, let's say, some trees here, just really rough like this. And they're getting smaller and lighter as they move further back. And I'll just roughly add some trunks to the trees. So this is an example of trees moving back into space from a larger size to a smaller size, from a darker value to a lighter value, progressing back into space. And then what I could do is maybe add some light falling on these trees like this. So the idea here is to create a world that looks three-dimensional. So a painting may have this. Could be a painting in which the two-dimensional look is dominant. But I'm talking about paintings that have this three-dimensional appearance to them, where perspective is part of the painting, where you try to get that feeling of depth and distance into the painting. So much of art instruction is involved in teaching the student how to create a three-dimensional looking world like this. However, there's also another level to a great painting that isn't talked about that much. And that other level is the level that doesn't concern itself with a three-dimensional appearance like this, or an appearance of perspective or depth. And that other level is only concerned with two-dimensional shapes. These shapes are all two-dimensional. They don't have any depth like this picture here. These shapes have height and width. That's all. There's no depth to them. A painting is basically a flat surface. Even though this little rough painting I did gives you the feeling of depth, of perspective, of distance, it still exists on a two-dimensional surface that has height and width. Just as these shapes here are two-dimensional and have height and width, like I pointed out to you earlier. A painting like this little rough sketch exists simultaneously on a two-dimensional flat surface, but it gives you the illusion of a three-dimensional world. Any really good or great painting that has an appearance of 3 dimensions, like I tried to indicate here, where you get that feeling of perspective and depth and distance, and a feeling of solid 3-dimensional volumes, has at its base a structure that is 2-dimensional, like this, consisting of these kind of 2-dimensional shapes that I pointed out to you. So even though a painting looks 3-dimensional, it has at its base, or at its foundational level, a 2-dimensional arrangement or composition. So both the 3 dimensions and the 2 dimensions are part of a really good composition. The 2-dimensional structure is not neglected in a really great painting or a good painting. If it is neglected, then it's lacking one of the most important parts of what makes a really great composition. Judging by the many paintings that are done, everyone seems to be overly concerned with trying to get a 3-dimensional appearance, trying to learn how to render objects so that they have volume and solidity and a 3-dimensional appearance. That's all well and good, but unfortunately, this 2-dimensional underlying structure is being neglected, and therefore a vital part of what makes a really great composition is being left out. In this video, I talk about the structural concept. And the structural concept involves establishing this kind of 2-dimensional underlying structure within the painting that underlies the more realistic-looking 3-dimensional painting. This 2-dimensional underlying structure that I'm talking about is the skeleton, so to speak, of the painting. It lies at its base. It's the foundation for the painting. As you'll be learning in this video, this underlying structure consists of simple geometric shapes. This structure is the underlying geometry of a composition, and it involves what are called implied lines, which you'll be learning about in this video. If you are a student, it's vitally important that you develop the ability to see a picture as a flat rectangle covered with flat shapes without being confused by the other visual elements, such as you see in this example, where there is a more 3-dimensional world that has been established. To learn even more about this underlying structure that I'm talking about in this series of videos, it's vitally important for you to also see my other videos on design and composition, in which I also talk about this underlying structure. And you'll be able to see even more examples and learn even more about this important aspect of composition. So not only is it important for you to watch this series of videos, but also to watch those other videos that I have on the underlying structure that is part of the composition and design series of videos. So please check those out also to learn even more about the underlying structure. As you'll see in this video series, while many of the underlying structures contain straight lines like this that divide up the pictorial space, which is all of this, that's the picture area, the pictorial space on which you work and paint your picture. There are also underlying structures that consist of more curvilinear or rhythmic lines like this, S-lines, reverse curves as they're also referred to, and they are found many times in landscapes, such as this one. So in this landscape, you can see this kind of rhythmic line, and you can see it here, for example, this undulating line, and then there's a rhythmic line here, dipping down into that one, and then in the background where these mountains are, there's this rhythmic line like that, and then another one back here where that other mountain is, undulating line like that. So you can see that this structure consists of these rhythmic lines instead of the picture space being divided up with straight lines like that. And this kind of structure gives a more organic feel to the entire painting, which is very appropriate to landscapes. A greater feeling of movement and life is also established with these kind of rhythmic lines. I'm going to eliminate the painting, and this way you'll see the structure without the painting getting in the way. What I want to point out is that even though this structure doesn't consist of straight lines like this, the shapes that are created with these rhythmic lines are also two-dimensional shapes. They have height and they have width, but they don't have any depth. When establishing this kind of underlying structure, the lines that you establish with these implied lines that you'll be learning about, those lines need to lead to the center of interest. And they also need to lead the eye around the picture so that various parts of the picture are also taken in. But the main thing is to lead the eye to the center of interest. So all these lines here, this one leads over to that one, and that one leads down like this. So the center of interest in this example could be established right here, let's say. Maybe there's a big tree here. And all these lines, these structural lines, these implied lines, are leading the eye to this center of interest over here. So getting back to this little rough sketch, that center of interest would then occur somewhere around here, a larger tree. So something like this, for example. And I could add some light falling on the tree. It's very rough, as you can see. But those lines are now leading to the center of interest, those structural lines. And I'll add some arrows to make it more clear. This line's moving down, this one's moving up, that one's moving over, or if it leads back there, it's leading to that line, as I mentioned earlier. And that line is then leading over to other lines and over to the center of interest. In addition, this line right there, that one also is leading over to this line that in turn then leads up to the center of interest. This structure that I've been showing you here, that structure is established with what are called implied lines, which I'll be talking about later in the video. But I'll also talk about how shapes can set up implied lines, like these trees, for example. They also help to lead here to the center of interest. The eye follows these shapes because they're similar, and those shapes set up an implied line that lead to the edge of this shape, which is an implied line. Since it's not an actual line, it's referred to as an implied line. This underlying structure is designed so that the eye of the viewer is led to the center of interest or focal point. So I'm going to be doing some really rough and quick sketches to show you these different kinds of underlying structures or armatures. And once you understand how they are constructed, you'll be able to easily construct your own. So starting with a rough sketch here, I want to mention again this idea that the structure is designed to lead the eye of the viewer to the center of interest. The structure also consists of what is called implied lines. And again, if you watched my videos on composition, you will have learned about implied lines because I talk about implied lines in those videos in which I talk about this underlying structure. I'm going to draw a line here and then another line over here. Now, as you can see, there's a gap between those two lines. That gap has an invisible line referred to as an implied line. And that invisible line connects these two actual lines. you feel like this line is continuing, even though there isn't a line here. You feel like it is continuing into this other line. So therefore, you have this implied line or invisible line, or it's also referred to as a subjective line. Your brain connects these two lines by this invisible line. So it feels like the line here is continuing into the other line. But this kind of implied line only results when the two lines line up. If I erase this line and move it down a little bit like that, now the implied line is no longer there because the lines don't line up with each other. So you don't get that feeling of a line continuing into another line. That only happens if the lines are lined up like this. What you also need to know about implied lines is that implied lines are not just made this way, but let's say I quickly do this little rough sketch of some kind of robot maybe. Really rough. So something like this maybe. Now I'm going to reduce the size a little bit, like that. And then I'm going to repeat that robot and repeat it over here as well. There's a implied line formed here, even though there aren't any actual lines. The implied line occurs here at the edge of the shapes, which forms this kind of implied line, stretching from one edge of a shape to the edge of the other shape. You get the feeling that there is this invisible line or implied line there, like you see here. And this is very important to know because when you're doing your compositions, you're working with shapes, and these shapes at their edge will, when repeated with other shapes, form these kind of invisible or implied lines. Another quick example that I'll give you is this hand that I'm just quickly sketching in here. The tips of these fingers here form an implied line, like this. That implied line connects the tips of the fingers, forming a curve. Same idea that you see over here. To show you an example of what I've been showing you here, I'm going to do a quick rough sketch, just a thumbnail sketch, and let's say it's with these figures here, and a smaller figure back there like that. So when you take a look at this figure, that one and that one, the edge of their head, and it doesn't have to be a big edge, those heads form an implied line like that. You see? They connect with this invisible line, just like these robots form this invisible line here, or the fingers form this invisible curve here. It's the same sort of thing that occurs here, forming this invisible or implied line. Here's another quick, rough thumbnail sketch using this idea that I've been talking about. So let's say there's this figure standing here on this rock. And way in the distance, there are some mountains here.
the mountains over on the other side as well. So he's way up on this mountain looking down on these other mountains and the ground here. And let's say he's holding a weapon. Now, there is an alignment that is occurring here, creating an implied line, just like you see here and here, as I pointed out to you. Now, where is that to be seen? Well, it's to be seen here, starting where the mountain is. Going around, touching the tips of the mountain, then the edge of his costume, up like that, and towards his gun, like that. So there's this oval-like shape right there. And I can add these dots, like I did with the other examples, to indicate this implied line or invisible line, resulting from this invisible line touching the tips of the shapes or the edges of the shapes, just like you see with the hand here, where that implied line touches the tips of the fingers, or in this example where the implied line touches the edge of the shapes. Now this implied line or invisible line has a direction moving toward the figure. Remember what I said, that these implied lines need to lead to the center of interest, which in this case happens to be the figure. Now, since this line is moving up like that toward the figure and into the gun, there needs to be a way to stop the eye from continuing on its momentum that it has acquired and moving right out of the picture area. Now, how do you do that? How do you stop the eye from moving straight out of the picture area because this gun is pointing out of the picture area? Well, you can do that by adding some kind of counter movement here to the gun. So this is a counter movement. It is moving in the opposite direction of the gun. So there could be some kind of something here on this weapon that has that diagonal direction like that. And that stops the eye from moving over toward the right and out of the picture area. So these kind of implied lines or invisible lines or subjective lines, they need to lead to the center of interest. You can't have them moving away in all sorts of different directions that don't lead to the center of interest. The edge of this rock that he is standing on here, those edges lead up toward the figure like that. So everything's pointing toward the figure. The mountains are moving toward the figure, aside from that implied line that is moving toward the figure. And I could even add some mountains right there that are pointing up toward the figure. So everything needs to be directed toward the center of interest, which, as you know, in this case happens to be this figure. So when you set up the underlying structure, or the framework structure, that structure consisting of lines and shapes that I'm going to be showing you in a minute here, they all must be arranged in such a way so that the eye is attracted to the center of interest or led to the center of interest. Another thing I want to point out, and that is that it's not just the edges or tips of shapes like you see here with the hand that form these implied lines or invisible lines, as they're also referred to, but the shapes themselves form an implied line. The shapes of these robots moving across the page like this form an implied line like that. Let's say I have a figure over here, Again, just quickly roughing in some kind of shape that suggests a figure. And then I'll have another figure a little further away, something like this. And then another one maybe up here that's even further away. And the horizon can be way up there with some mountains in the back like that. These shapes, these figures, form an implied line, an invisible line, just like I showed you over here, with these shapes forming this implied line right there. So the implied line is like this for this rough sketch. It follows those shapes of the figures, creating that invisible line or implied line. So you don't actually see a line here, of course. You just get the feeling that there is some kind of connection here between these shapes, forming this invisible line. When you're working out the underlying structure or framework of the composition, which this video is about, within that structure there is these implied lines, and the implied lines create continuity. And continuity moves the eye uninterruptedly through the composition from one part to another. And it is these implied lines that create this continuity. Not only do they do that, but they also help to hold the composition together. In addition to the implied lines, the underlying structure contains shapes and lines. So for example, if I want to draw the eye of the viewer to the center of interest, which your structure should do, consisting of lines and shapes, and also a combination of shapes are used. So here I have the circle, but I could also combine it with the rectangle. And then I could also add a line. And this could be my underlying structure. So it could be something like this, for example. And then this line here would be a figure standing here, like this, for example. The figure is represented by the line. The line that this figure represents is actually an implied line, a vertical or perpendicular line. And then back here there could be maybe some kind of symbol or something, and then over here something else that makes a rectangular shape. So this is just a very rough example. And the eye of the viewer is led here to the figure, and specifically to the head. The structure has been designed to draw the attention to the figure and then to the head, because the circle here forms a framing shape. It frames this part of the figure, thereby drawing the eye to that part of the figure. I'll do another quick rough thumbnail sketch here. So let's say there's a figure over here, and he's holding something, maybe a sword or some kind of weapon. In back of him there is another figure, and he's kneeling on this rock. Now this is very abstract, very rough. This is how you actually should begin your compositions, working them out in really rough, quick, small thumbnails like this, in which you also suggest what the value pattern should be, Right now you can see this dark value against the lighter background. And what I'm going to do is add some more rock on this side. This is also a rock. And then back here there's a horizon and a spaceship back there. So I have that oval for a spaceship. Something like that, really rough. And maybe there's this mountain back here. They're actually on a mountain. Let's say they're on a mountain, and you see more of the mountain back here. Then there's a planet that can be seen, part of the planet, maybe right there, like that. I'll darken this some more. So these two figures form a group. And then way back there in the distance, there's that spaceship. Now the question is, what kind of underlying structure can I make out of this? Get the red color. Okay, so the planet has an edge that is pointing down to this figure. This part of the rock that they're on, which is part of a mountain, is moving up and pointing to this figure here. This part of the mountain back there is moving down toward the figure. So these lines, these major lines, are all pointing toward the figure. And one of the requirements of the implied lines is that they form a structure that leads to the center of interest. So this line can be continued within the figure here. Maybe there's a line there, and then it's continued by this rock here, like that. And in between those lines is the implied line or invisible line that I'm adding those dots to, like that. So let me draw this line over like that. And then this line over here, like this, can come down around that figure in the foreground. The whole group forms something of a circle. So that circle, contrasting with those lines there, those curving lines, draws the eye to the circle, which is where the center of interest is located. So this structure has been designed to lead to the center of interest. So that's the structure. And I could even go further by having maybe an additional line moving over like that and forming a rectangle shape that I'm filling in right now. You see that rectangle shape, which contrasts with the circle shape, and thereby further helping to draw attention to this area where the center of interest is, and providing a nice geometric shape that contrasts with the circle geometric shape. And they both in turn contrast with the curving lines. And I also now have a large geometric shape here that I'm filling in, which is this rectangle shape, or it's close to a square shape actually. So all of these shapes, with the addition of the circle, helps to create a structure that draws the eye to the center of interest. Thereby, those requirements are fulfilled in this structure, that the lines and shapes lead to the center of interest. If you've watched my other videos on composition, you will already have learned about this underlying structure that I'm talking about. This is a very important subject, and therefore I decided to make another video of this and cover some things that I may not have talked enough about. With this video, I'm giving you additional information, additional knowledge, which consists not only of the implied lines that I showed you and talked about, but also about rhythm. I may not have talked enough about the importance of rhythm appearing within this underlying structure. This underlying structure needs to be a rhythmic structure. So I'm going to be talking more about the importance of rhythm and how it is applied to this underlying structure. And this structure here is a simple structure, and let me just redraw that without the images in back. So it's a rhythmic line like that and another rhythmic line coming down like that. Those two are intersecting. Then there's a horizontal line and then the circle, and all of those lines and the contrast of lines and shapes, the square or near square, a bit more of a rectangle, and then the rectangle down here contrasting with the circle, and the curving or rhythmic lines or reverse curves, as they're also referred to, or S lines, contrast with the straight line here of the horizon. And all of that helps to draw the attention of the viewer to where the center of interest is located, which is right there. And as I mentioned, that's how you need to design this underlying structure so that it leads to the center of interest and not away from it. Earlier in the video, I talked about the structural concept. Now the question arises, what comes first? Do you first have some kind of structural concept in mind? For example, it could be based on this spider's web. That could be the structural concept. So when you do your little thumbnail sketch trying to work out some composition, you keep this idea or structural concept of a spider's web in mind when you're placing the shapes. So over here I could have some other figures. They're all huddled together like this, maybe holding each other. And then over here there's this large figure, and that figure could be some kind of monster, some kind of alien maybe, and another one on this side over here. And I'm thinking about this web-like structure where the lines would be coming out like this. The shapes would be placed according to some of these lines. So I might have a figure up here that's rushing down, and maybe another figure over here that's rushing down, running down something, or flying toward these figures. And then there could be something over here, maybe some rocks or something like that, that would just suggest this kind of web-like structure. And the reason why this web-like structure is selected in the first place is because it best expresses what I want to say, which is, for example, that these figures here are caught in a kind of spider's web by these creatures that are surrounding them. So this structural concept of a spider's web helps me to get that message across, helps me to say what I want to say in this picture. So that's why a structural concept is selected, because the one that you select should be one that helps to say what you want to say, what you want to communicate. You could still end up with a really good picture, even though it doesn't have this structural concept. But if you can think of a structural concept, then so much the better for your picture. You'll be able to get your message across much clearer, much more forcefully than if that structural concept were not there. So if you wanted to get this idea across of a figure, let's say this figure is standing here like that, but you want to get this idea across that he is surrounded by these alien creatures. Well, how would you do that? Well, you'd have to base it on the surround structural concept, like this. He is surrounded by aliens. And I'm just roughly expressing that idea with these ovals that I'm indicating. So I would then add these aliens here to form this oval. He is being surrounded. That's how you get that idea across, that message. This is the best way. What other way would you get this idea across that he is being surrounded, except by having him surrounded by these creatures? Let me do another quick sketch, and this time a more horizontal format. And the structural concept I have in mind is an arrow. Now, this kind of structural concept would be good for a subject that is racing, let's say, toward the right. And maybe there are a lot of figures, and they're all racing toward the right. So those figures could be arranged somewhat to look or vaguely resemble some kind of arrow-like structure. And they don't all have to be figures. You could have some other things mixed in there. But you get the feeling that they're all rushing toward the right because the arrow is pointing toward the right. It's a great concept for getting this message across of speed and movement toward the right. So you see, this is similar to an arrow, but don't make it look exactly like that. You add some other shapes, things beyond that suggestion of an arrow shape so that it doesn't look too obvious. But you still need to get that feeling that it's based on an arrow. And now it's time to get around to talking about what I mentioned earlier about rhythmic structures. So your underlying structure is a rhythmic structure. So let me just quickly indicate a rhythmic structure here. And before I talk about the rhythm that is set up within this structure, this cross structure, I want to first draw this shape here, and then I'm going to repeat it. So what I have here is repetition. And repetition means the regular occurrence of an element of design, such as in this case a shape. The shape that is recurring is exactly the same. It looks exactly the same. There's no change in it. The only change that occurs is in the spacing here, the interval of space between these shapes. But I'm concerned now with just the shapes and not the intervals of space between the shapes. So here I have repetition occurring. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to select these shapes and then make a copy of them. Next, I'll take this shape and enlarge it somewhat. And I'll take this one and reduce it like that. What I've done here is I've created a variation on this repetition of the rectangular shape. So I have a rhythm that is varied. This is a rhythm that is unvaried. And this kind of varied repetition is the most interesting kind. This creates a rather monotonous and uninteresting rhythm. And that's not what you want to get into your compositions. This is what you need to try to get into your compositions, as I'll be showing you in this video. It's varied repetition, resulting in a varied rhythm. For a composition to be good, or even great, it must possess unity and
variety or diversity. Now, unity is achieved when you have, let's say, a shape like this one here, for example, and it is repeated again and again, like in this example. There is unity because all of the shapes look the same. All of the values are the same. This value in here is a light value, which is the same as that one, and that one. So you could say this has a oneness to it. One kind of shape, one kind of value. Unity refers to oneness. But in order for a composition to be interesting, you need more than just unity, which can result in this kind of monotonous look. You also need variety. And when you look at this example, you see that kind of variety of sizes. And then if I add a different value here like that, I have variety of values. And I could even add a really dark value here like that to give me even more variety. So when I repeat a shape like this rectangle, and then I change it in various ways, such as this example shows, I then achieve both unity and variety. The unity consists of the same kind of rectangle shape repeated again and again. The variety or diversity exists in the fact that these shapes have been varied in their size and in their values. So in order to achieve unity, you have to repeat the same kind of shape again and again, but then you have to apply variety to that shape, like you see here, varying those other shapes. Let's say I add another shape here, but this shape is going to be a little different. And you can see the difference lies here, where this diagonal has been added. However, this shape is still similar enough to the other rectangular shapes for this shape to be part of the whole rhythm here. So even if you make a change in the shape, if that change is just a small change and not too radical, then that new shape still remains part of the rhythm. However, if you add a shape that is quite different, like this, for example, over here, when I add this oval, now this shape is not part of this rhythm here because it's too different. So if you want to retain a feeling of rhythm, then the elements of design must all be similar or the same, either like this, all the same, or varied like this. And this, however, as I mentioned, is more interesting than this, which is more monotonous. Therefore, it's this kind of variety of rhythm that you need to try to get into your compositions. And I can add more variety of values to this rhythm by adding a value over here, a light value. So there are different values now, and even different shapes. But overall, the shapes all look pretty much the same, except for this one. But it's not so different that it doesn't look like it belongs with the other shapes, forming this rhythm. And now getting back to this structure here. This structure is rhythmic because all of these shapes are rectangular shapes. This shape is more square, but nevertheless it has that rectangular character to it, and therefore it relates to all of the other shapes within this structure. And therefore this structure, because the shapes are all similar shapes, rectangular shapes, this structure is a rhythmic structure, even though the sizes are different, just like what I pointed out to you over here. Just because these sizes are different, that doesn't mean that there is no rhythm here. The rhythm is still there because the shapes are similar. They're all rectangular in shape, just as these shapes are all rectangular here. So in this structure here, one shape is used to create this structure, the rectangular shape. However, these underlying structures can also be constructed of more than just one shape. So therefore, I can combine shapes such as adding the circle here, which combines with the rectangular shape, creating this kind of structure. Using this structure here, I could build a picture on this and just roughly do something here with this figure. So this figure is standing here, has this long robe on, and the figure is holding some kind of staff or something. And in back of the figure, there's some kind of object. Maybe it's some kind of emblem or something. Maybe this is an imperial figure. Then I could add some tone up here, add a line here that's holding up that object, whatever it is. So here's the picture based on that structure that I established. Now this is just a rough indication of what could be done with this. Other subjects could be added to this structure. I could eliminate this line and that one. Don't need it. So I'll take that out. But remember the implied lines that I told you about. Because there's a line here and they line up, there's an implied line or an invisible line that exists between those lines. So I still basically have this line going across the picture area like that. Remember what I said, that the structure should be so constructed that it leads to the center of interest. And this structure does that. These lines here are all pointing in the direction of the center of interest. And then, of course, I have this framing element of the circle that draws your attention to the center of interest. And then I have the light value of that emblem in back against the dark value of the figure, creating a strong value contrast here, which further draws your eye to the figure. So the structure itself helps to lead to the center of interest. Now let's continue with this idea of the rhythmic underlying structure, and I'll just quickly do some rough sketches here. So let's say I'm going to use the circle, then I'm going to use radiating lines, like that. So I've got the circle and the radiating lines, and maybe another circle here like that. The lines are repeating, the circle is repeating. There's a rhythm because this circle is smaller than that circle. Remember what I talked about? The different sizes of the rectangular shapes setting up a rhythm. And that's what's occurring here. I'm using different sizes, but both of these shapes are basically circles. One smaller, the other larger, sets up a rhythm. Even though there are only two circles here, that still makes for a rhythm. That's all you need, is just two shapes like this, for example, that set up a rhythm. You don't need 3 or 4 or 5 shapes that are similar. A rhythm can be set up with only 2 shapes, like this or like this. And then, of course, there is the rhythm of these straight lines forming this radiation structure, which also divides the picture space into these triangle shapes. And there's a varied one up there. So the picture area is divided up with circles and triangles and those straight lines forming a radiation structure. Then I can use this structure and build some kind of picture on it. So maybe there's some kind of robot, let's say, back here. And then in the foreground,
Maybe there's a figure here. Figure's holding some kind of weapon, maybe pointing toward that robot. Another figure over here. And these elements that I'm adding, they need to conform to those lines that are radiating, but not exactly. All you need is just a suggestion of this radiation structure that is there. And maybe another shape over here, not sure what that could be. Another figure over here maybe. And this is actually similar to the spider web structure that I showed earlier. And then some other things that can be added here. So maybe the robot is flying some kind of rocket belt or something that he has, which suggests a circle, but doesn't actually form a perfect circle. Just a suggestion that there's a circular shape there, an implied shape. There are implied shapes and there are implied lines. Remember, if you think back to some of the other videos that I have on composition where I talk about implied shapes. Let's say, for example, take a look over here. This is an actual shape, but there's an implied shape that underlies that shape. And let me just indicate that implied shape. The implied shape is a geometric shape, a triangle shape, that underlies that more irregular shape that I just drew. So that's what's meant by an implied shape. It's that more simple, more geometric-like shape that underlies a shape that looks rather complicated, but has this more simple underlying geometric shape that is part of it. So getting back to this rough sketch here, so this robot has this kind of rocket belt, and he's flying around, and then over here there is a spaceship coming in, and then another one here. So you get that feeling of a radiation structure, the lines radiating out from where the robot is, and you have those circles, and that's the structure that I just based this rough sketch on. And of course this is very rough. Other things would be added to suggest what that larger circle might be.